Hello, welcome to Government Connection. My name is Vicki Evans. If you haven't heard, the meth or methamphetamine using and problem here in our area is really the catalyst for the largest increase in the volume of crime in the recent metropolitan Pima County area. And we're going to learn more about this today as we welcome Captain David Neri. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Captain Neri is the commander of the Pima County Tucson Metro Counter Narcotic Alliance.
Yes.
I just hit the thumbnail sketch of how large this meth problem is. So how do you define it as law enforcement?
Defining it is really unique to us because it's one of the three messages I want to make sure I leave you with today. It's one of the things that we as an organization and as a law enforcement jurisdiction do very uniquely across the United States. And simply said, we're able to actually define the depth of the problem by counting the number of crimes that have an association with methamphetamine. And in doing so, we get a really good picture of how methamphetamine impacts the community overall, far above and beyond what we would call simply a narcotics crime.
What is the difference then between a narcotics crime? How do you know that this crime was committed because of meth use or wanting money for meth?
We've actually established a criteria of behavior that helps us to read through an incoming case report, reflect back on what that criteria is, and then make a determination if there's a methamphetamine involvement or not. And it's pretty strict criteria. It involves names of known users, locations of known activity, things that are pretty solid to base our information on.
Okay. Well, Captain Neri brought a slideshow basically that he has put together along with the Meth-Free Alliance,
yes,
perhaps, and we'll be talking about them later. And let's take a look at the first slide,
sure,
and you've entitled it "Invisible to Us." So we're seeing, who are we seeing? Is that our native, our local,
yes,
wonderful cartoonist?
It's actually a sketch put together by Mr. Fitzsimmons for us, and was published here locally, and it kind of gives a question to folks who may not be aware of the impacts of methamphetamine. It goes through a few different frames that kind of exacerbates or demonstrates what it may look like to folks. And it's important to touch on this because methamphetamine can be invisible to a lot of our citizens. You don't look out the window and see methamphetamine on the corner, so to speak. But what you do see or what you do hear about are the number of people that perhaps you have as friends or neighbors on your block that have been burglarized. Property crime is a very close correlation to methamphetamine activity. As a matter of fact, we use property crime as an indicator of the volume of methamphetamine activity. So if you don't know someone who's involved in meth, you probably know someone who's been the victim of a burglary, or perhaps an auto theft, or perhaps some type of fraud crime such as credit card fraud or check theft out of their mailbox. Locally, our postal inspectors report back to us that in excess of 90% of all the mail fraud and mail-related theft that happens in Tucson is directly related to methamphetamine. So it's something that literally goes far and wide beyond just what we call the narcotic violation itself. You know, that being something like possession or possession for sale. Certainly we enforce that, but in truth we investigate those things in an effort to get to those underlying broader crimes that have a tendency to degrade the quality of life in our community.
Why wouldn't, for example, heroin users, why are the meth people doing this kind of crime so quickly? What's in it for them? You know, I know, you know, and when other drug users are using other types of drugs, the volume of crime didn't increase as much as you're talking about now. So what makes it so enticing for them to do this?
Well, there's always been an increase with that kind of substance abuse to some degree. The difference here is the volume in the short time frame that we've had to see an increase in. A lot of the information statistically that we have, we began to assemble in 2004. We've continued to update that through 2005, and in some cases have information up to date in 2006. There's a variation in that because of what's available. Probably the biggest difference that would serve to answer your question is that those other drugs can't be self-manufactured. Oh. Methamphetamine can be made in your kitchen. If you have the right ingredients, if you're willing to take the risks, the health risks involved. It's not something that you need to go out and purchase. Our best estimates, and they are only estimates, are that probably about 70% of all of the methamphetamine available in Tucson, in fact, is Mexican methamphetamine, made in the country of Mexico, transported here, much like the other drugs that you mentioned. But probably 25 to 30% of it is actually manufactured here, and therein lies the crime-related issue. In short, the folks that are bringing Mexican meth into the United States aren't necessarily bringing it in for distribution in Tucson. We've been known for many years nationally as a pass-through point, a transshipment point to be exact. And it's headed for other places. It's headed for New York, it's headed for Los Angeles, it's headed for Georgia, different places around the United States. But that 25 to 30% that's manufactured here is manufactured by people who live here. So they're not simply passing through trying to draw a little attention to themselves. They live here and to, in some cases, support themselves. They're committing a volume of crime in the areas that they live, or certainly areas adjacent to where they live. And that's where that crime association really comes from.
Okay. And again, let's take a look at some maps that you've brought that kind of shows us where the more or less, right? Where more crime is being held or less. What are we seeing here?
We can take a look at a couple of things. As you see, this is a 2004 statistic, and it kind of shows a distribution of seizure sites that we've had around the city. And this is information that comes right out of the National HIDA database for the local area. If we move to the next slide, which is just more of a close-up of that, you can see those areas as bigger blots, and again, you see the distribution. But you'll notice in about the middle of the screen, there's a small circle around a series of about 5 or 6 of those. We selected those randomly, and then what we did is we drew a quarter-mile radius circle around each one of those seizure sites. And if we go to the next slide, you can see what we have there is we plotted all of the associated crime that happens within a quarter-mile of those seizure sites on that map. So every place
the seizure sites are the dark blue.
Yes.
And then the light blue is crime. The things.
Well, you have in the case of it looks like little squares or little houses. Those are burglaries or other property crimes. If there's what looks like a small body, that is a violent crime.
Oh my gosh.
If it's a needle, it is a narcotics crime other than a methamphetamine crime. If it's a small vehicle, it represents an auto theft or a vehicle larceny. So you start to get a visual perspective on this volume of crime and how it's affecting our neighborhoods.
Well, we're talking about. Let's talk about the common forms of addiction, perhaps, and of methamphetamine.
Sure. Well, if we skip ahead a couple of slides, there's actually one in there that shows, I think it's 20 common forms of methamphetamine. And this one is always important for us to demonstrate to our viewers, because a lot of folks ask us at public meetings, you know, what does it look like? What does it smell like? If I see it, will I know? And they're really hoping we could give them some more definitive answers, much like we've done in past with things like marijuana or other drugs that are more simpler.
How does one know? How is this ingested? Is it smoked, shot up, or swallowed?
This can be injected any way into the body. All those things. It can be eaten. It can be dissolved and drank. It can be injected. It can be smoked. It can be mixed with other chemicals. Any form of consumption is possible with this. And the variety of forms that you see exist because in the area of self-manufacturing, there are a number of chemicals that a person can use to create this. And they're all horrible things that you would never want to put in your body, such as gasoline additives, charcoal lighter fluid, battery acids, just terrible things that you would ingest. But the result comes in different forms of the product. So you see that variety of things. It makes it real difficult for us to actually turn to someone and say, it's going to look exactly like this. But if we take a look at the next slide, we'll see the form that's the most common on the streets of Tucson, and that's ice or crystal methamphetamine. And you can see it there. It kind of almost looks like crushed or ground up glass. And that is a very pure form of methamphetamine. Mexican methamphetamine also resembles this. That's probably in excess of 90–95% pure in that photograph right there. So it's very potent stuff.
I've heard that treatment centers and rehab facilities are experiencing a meth addict or someone who is addicted to methamphetamine. It's a quick addiction. I mean, it's difficult to. It's almost as though the grip is stronger than other drugs. Am I correct, or?
Yeah, very much so. One of the things that we profess is something that we learned from our treatment partners, because of course we're the enforcement arm. We don't do the rest of it. But what they've taught us and what they've educated us to believe is that methamphetamine is the most addictive drug on the streets in Tucson. You can be a one-time use addict in some cases. That's probably not the most prevalent, but continued use over a short period of time makes it the most addictive drug. It's one of the most inexpensive drugs, primarily because of its availability, because it can be self-manufactured, so all contributing to its popularity, if you will, overall. And what our treatment professionals have told us to kind of support these things is that it not only is it the most addictive drug from their perspective, it's the most difficult addiction to overcome.
That's what I was trying to get out.
If you're unfortunate enough to find yourself addicted to it, it's a very difficult battle to come out a winner on the other side. They've also taught us that it requires a different type of treatment than most other drugs do, that residential therapy is typically the one that is the most successful, although there are others. They've also told us that the typical 6-month detox, type thing that is most common in insurance and some other drug treatments doesn't work here. That nothing less than a 1-year intensive program. There are states in this country that have 3-year programs specifically designed for methamphetamine.
What about, let's talk two things, the cost to your body. What does it do to your body, and the cost to society?
It's really devastating to your body, and most folks don't see that when they first get started, and it's almost the unwitting victim type of perspective. Because when you start to use methamphetamine, again, our treatment professionals tell us this, as well as do many recovering addicts who've given us the privilege of talking to them about what their experience has been, in this. And what they report back is that, frankly, it's quite exciting when you first get started. You have an increased sexuality, you have an increased level of activity and productivity, don't need much sleep, you can accomplish a whole lot in a day, there's weight loss that goes along with it, you seem to be the life of the party, you become more social, everybody wants to be around you because you're the big person on campus. What they don't realize is that there is immediate destructive and irreversible components of that happens really from the very beginning. And if we could jump ahead, I think there's a couple slides there that actually show some pictures that may be better at visualizing that. There's one that is a photo of the brain. And again, this is research material that we were able to incorporate through permission. And what it shows is areas of the brain that are cause tissue damage. So you actually lose components. And as you look at this on the screen, all those areas in red are areas that cause damage that in most cases are irreversible.
I was just going to say irreversible. Huh?
So, and you can see impacts to a lesser degree across the brain, but pretty much as this touches nerve tissue, it destroys it. So what your body was once able to do, what you were once capable of doing, you become less and less capable of doing the longer that you tend to use it. And if we move to the next one, you see an excellent listing that was actually published here in the Tucson Citizen. I think it's entitled Devastating Effects of Meth.
Right.
The important thing there, because you can't read all those little things, is to just note that it's almost every area of the body that is impacted.
Oh my gosh.
The largest component you see there is the brain. That first great listing there shows the destructive measures there. It moves down to the mouth, to the skin, and these are become real visible things. You may have seen pictures of meth mouth or some of the before and after photos that are pretty much famous across the country now, and you see those devastating effects. That is both a combination of what methamphetamine as a chemical will do to you, in addition to some of those terrible things that methamphetamine is made with.
Okay, so the cost to yourself is horrible.
Yes.
What about the cost to society? Perhaps we can go back, we skip forward, maybe we can go back in the slideshow and talk about the cost to society.
Well, there are many. The cost to society, number one, the ultimate response to untreated methamphetamine addiction is death. So there's a high cost there in terms of losing members of our society. But there are many other things that are perhaps more practical to folks who aren't involved with it, such as property costs. Each time we find a meth lab inside of a home or an apartment or a hotel room, which are very common, what you're looking at is somewhere between a $10,000 and $25,000 cleanup cost per location. That's just the initial police response and the detoxing, the packaging up of those what would be very dangerous chemicals otherwise. Then, according to our current laws, the rest of the remediation for that property is left to the property owner. And it's important to understand how costly that is, because you cannot cook methamphetamine in any type of a closed environment without producing a film that literally adheres to any and every surface, porous and non-porous.
Okay.
If it's a non-porous surface, it can be washed off. If it's a porous surface, such as ceiling tile, carpeting on the floors, wallboard, wood, anything of that category, in most cases it has to be torn out and replaced. So in effect, if this was a badly affected home, let's say, you would have to virtually remodel the interior of the house to successfully remediate that property. So in addition to the taxpayer burden of the police response and the law enforcement response, there's the individual responsibility. Many of these sites involved what amounts to a toxic dump in the backyard, in the alley, in the trash cans, where the waste products are left as a result. In some cases, in many cases, we find that they've been poured into the ground, creating an environmental hazard right there that has to be cleaned up with professional services. So there's a great taxpayer burden right up front, to say nothing of the crime, the additional medical costs, of all of which get filtered to us one way or another.
What about cost to children? You know, so much of this self-manufactured is done in a home, in a neighborhood situation.
There are devastating costs to children. As a matter of fact, there's one slide I hope we can find and put up there that involves a picture of a child that was actually taken out of a meth lab in Maricopa County, so right here in Arizona. There aren't many of these in Tucson. We're happy to say that, but there are certain, one is more than enough. In Maricopa County, they've had quite a volume, and this is one of them. This little girl, if I could spend just an extra moment here.
Please.
You see some black-looking substance on parts of her body. This is that black, greasy, grimy stuff that forms on the top of car batteries. So if you open up the hood and you look down there, it looks like something you don't want to touch. That's what that is. And she has that all over her body because her parents were pouring sulfuric acid right out of car batteries into some type of receptacle in their kitchen that they were using to help cook methamphetamine. The batteries were left on the kitchen floor, and she unfortunately started to play with them. So everywhere you see that black substance on her body, that represents a light acid burn to that child. And in addition, because of that substance, because of that the plume we talked about earlier that sticks on everything.
Right.
This child actually tested positive for methamphetamine.
I was going to ask, even if you're not ingesting it or using it, if you're cooking it, or I don't know, is cooking the term these days, then that film would, you said it was porous, and our skins are porous.
Absolutely. There's a clean absorption factor that happens there. There's no doubt about it. And children here are really some of the most devastating victims if we look at it from that perspective. They're unwitting. They don't know better. Literally, if they live in a home where methamphetamine is being produced, everything that they touch has the potential for exposing them to either methamphetamine itself or something perhaps even more toxic, as the battery acid was for this particular child. But on a national level, we find children in at least 25% of all the meth labs that have to be remediated medically to some degree. That number is tentatively rising up to closer to 50%. One that really strikes home is right here in Pima County. Child Protective Services reported that in 2004 they had 600 removals, children taken out of homes simply because of methamphetamine exposure. That's 600 is a pretty big number for our county.
That's a huge number for our county. What can we do about this?
You know, there's a number of things we can do, and a lot of it is taking back our neighborhoods. I know people like to hear that phrase. But there's an organization in town that I wish everyone would be a part of. It's called the Meth-Free Alliance. And the Meth-Free Alliance is really a grassroots community mobilization effort that volunteers have come forward and said, let us help, let us do something about this. And what we've done from a police perspective is try to encourage them to do more than an eyes and ears campaign. We don't ever want to diminish the importance of calling the police when you see something suspicious. But the truth is we need people to come out and actually help do the work.
Okay. And we've got some contact information.
Sure we do.
Let's share that with you because, as Captain Neary is saying, it's a problem that affects all of us. And the Meth-Free Alliance, their phone number, 792-3523. That's 792-3523. And check out the website always. It's www.methfreealliance.org. And grassroots, so as you said, people like you and I, my neighbors.
Absolutely, people like you and I.
And law enforcement's working very closely with them.
Very much so. We have 9 task force groups that they have self-organized into. And ironically, they are exactly what I think the community needs to help this problem. They have folks that are working in public information, and these are professional advertisers that are coming forward, doing pro bono work, providing design work, providing materials, helping get the word out through professional channels. There is a legislative task force that literally is working on new legislation that will help treatment obtain more resources that they need, will provide prevention opportunities, especially for the young folks, provide resources to law enforcement. So we have those arenas going very much strong. There's law enforcement coordination within there. There's just a variety of areas that folks can come out and be a part of. We're growing so much in this arena. I think we're in excess of 300 members now in the Meth-Free Alliance. We're looking at establish 2 new task forces there, one to work specifically with youth and education, another one to work with our business and economic development components, because the truth is, if we want to eradicate methamphetamine from Tucson, we have to change the norms across the board. Everyone needs to think about it a little bit differently. It can't be okay in any corner of our city, because if it is, that's where it'll grow.
Captain Neary, when you talk to young people and teens and school children, what are they aware of this? Are they aware of the dangers? Do they think it can't happen to them? Are they the most vulnerable market for methamphetamine sales? How is that?
You know, we run the gambit of responses. We really do. The last time we looked at exactly who the offenders were, what the demographics came back at, and this was strictly people we arrested, so we could have missed a whole bunch more out there, but of the folks that were under arrest, 72% were white males between the ages of 16 and 41. So it gives you kind of a different view of who might be involved in that. The second largest user group from that arrest data were Hispanics within that same age range. One of the things that we've seen from interviewing some of the folks that we come in contact with is that this has a tendency to continue to creep closer to younger ages.
See, that's what
and you know, a lot of that has to do with the fact that it mixes well, unfortunately, it mixes well with other pharmaceuticals. So it mixes well with ecstasy, it mixes well with opiates. And this necessarily isn't new. I remember back many 30, 40 years ago when methamphetamine was called crank or speed and was being used then, people would use the term speedballing, which meant they were using methamphetamine to get high or as a stimulant, and then they were using some type of opiate like heroin or methadone to bring themselves back down. We see those patterns reliving themselves now in some of our younger folks. And part of that is because it's very much available at things like raves, at large parties, you know, at youthful gatherings where you see some of these other pharmaceuticals initially.
All right. And again, if you'd like to learn more and help, participate, volunteer, find out more information, contact the Meth-Free Alliance, and we've got the information for you. It is the Meth-Free Alliance, grassroots organization, 300 members, growing. Phone number 792-3523, 792-3523, and the website www.methfreealliance.org. You said there was a legislative task force within the... What kinds of things do you think the legislature or lawmakers perhaps need to consider, and perhaps what kind of laws do you think might be needed?
You know, I'd like to point out that there's really 3 levels of that kind of intervention in support for these programs. One of them literally is at the state level and at the federal level, where they would enact laws that would affect us on a broader scope. And the state legislators are doing a good job with this. There are, I believe, 9 bills active right now as you and I sit here today, being considered by both the Congress and the Senate up in Phoenix, that impact different arenas for this. Everything from education funds for children, for financing additional treatment and bed space for those folks that we can resolve the addiction with, as well as different kinds of enforcement tools that will help law enforcement. So that's the first one, and that's the one you tend to think of when you use the word legislative. But let's not forget about our city ordinances and things that we can do locally. The City of Tucson, the mayor and council here, have been very proactive and very successful in enacting a local ordinance here that requires folks to put pseudoephedrine products behind the counters, literally in every retail outlet that sells those things. That's very true. And that's a substantial impact a positive one that we're seeing here, because the one thing that you cannot do without in terms of the chemicals you need to create methamphetamine is pseudoephedrine or some ephedrine derivative. So making those things less accessible is a truly successful combating effort there against those tabletop labs that we find in kitchens and apartments and things along that line.
That's great, because they say the simplest ideas are the best. I mean, it's just literally moving it away, so you can't just pick it off the shelf.
Well, let me share with you a fact that we discovered. We've been around the country to a few different places, talk with our peers and other sister cities to find out what they're doing. What we've discovered is that across the board, every single jurisdiction that has affected any kind of legislation that requires pseudoephedrine products to be less available has seen almost an immediate and dramatic reduction in the number of labs occurring within their jurisdiction. So it's that important of an act just in that one simple ordinance. And the last one of those things that I love to have the legislative folks review are policy decisions. Many of our court processes, many of our resource allocations aren't necessarily things that are set in law, they're things that are set in policy. So looking at those—
Can you give me for an example?
Well, for an example, the county attorney's office and the presiding judges in Superior Court have a chance to determine what the uses of our drug court is, how many folks are funded for a drug court, what its availability is, who gets in, who doesn't, what the penalties are for not being successful, or the kinds of resources that could be allocated to make them successful.
So that's not law, that's policy.
Policy decisions,
okay.
Founded in law, but basically
Right.
policy decisions here. A lot of the resources that we choose to allocate as law enforcement against this crime versus other crimes, again, policy decisions, things that are done here locally that we can choose for ourselves.
Right. We've only got a couple of minutes. What do you see, what would you, we've talked a lot about the problem and ways to tackle it. What do you see down the road? What would you do? How do you see this coalescing and perhaps getting a handle on it? You talked it this way, and we're going to the Meth-Free Alliance. What would happen if we don't?
You know, the mayor answered that best, I think, at the very first public call for action that he was kind enough to come out and do with us. And he got up to the podium and he said to the people of the community, we could lose our community to this drug if we don't do something about it. And I absolutely believe that statement. I think it was a great summation of what we had done in terms of conveying information to him how serious the problem was. And I think we are already seeing some good reductions. We've seen reductions in property crime for a variety of different initiatives, but certainly this is a strong contributor just over the last 18 months that we've been paying attention to it. What we've learned in that time frame is that we as law enforcement, in concert with the community, have an opportunity to successfully influence what this drug does to our community. What we've yet to assure ourselves of is that our efforts can be sustained over the course of time. So we are now working very diligently with neighborhood organizations, with the Meth-Free Alliance, to ensure we have that community solution in mind, because the one thing we say cautiously but honestly is our best understanding, law enforcement cannot provide a solution to this by itself.
Right.
We definitely have to have the community involvement. Beyond that Eyes and Ears campaign, coming out, working to take back your neighborhoods, not giving them up to the drug dealers.
Thank you. Captain David Neary, thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Cheers.